My name is Priya and I am 29 years old. I spent 4 years, exactly 1,461 days, building a doctoral dissertation on acquired drug resistance patterns in pediatric oncology patients. I worked in a fourth-floor research lab that smelled of ethanol and the dry overnight heat of centrifuges that never fully stopped running. I filled 7 composition notebooks with handwritten experimental data, margin hypotheses, and revision notes dated from the first week of my doctoral program to the last. I sent 847 pages of progressive drafts to my advisor via email across 4 years, creating a timestamp chain that documented every intellectual step I had taken from my opening research question to my final conclusion. 3 weeks before my scheduled doctoral defense, I was at my desk running a PubMed citation search when the title appeared in my results. Acquired Resistance Patterns in Pediatric Oncology, a Multi-Drug Analysis. Author, Lawrence Davenport, PhD, Harvard University, Department of Clinical Pharmacology. I had written every word of that paper. My dissertation, all 312 pages of it, developed across 4 years of laboratory work, clinical data analysis, and 12 rounds of drafts I could trace back to the day I started, had been published in the Journal of Clinical Pharmacology under my advisor's name alone. No co-authorship. No acknowledgement. My name appeared nowhere in the document. The abstract, the methodology section, the discussion, the conclusion, I recognized them the way you recognize your own voice played back in a recording. With a specific certainty that lives in your body before your brain has finished processing what your eyes are reading. I sat at that desk for 19 minutes. I know because I checked the clock when the title appeared and I checked it again when I stood up. Then I opened the first composition notebook, the black and white marbled one from the fall semester of my first year, dated September 4th, for years and 2 months before that afternoon, and I started building the case. This is every decision I made, every document I used, and exactly what happened to the man who submitted my 4 years of intellectual labor under his own name 3 weeks before I was supposed to defend it. My father arrived in the United States from Kerala, India in 1988 with a master's degree in electrical engineering, $340 in savings, and a job offer from a telecommunications company in Columbus, Ohio that he had accepted without ever having seen the city. My mother joined him 8 months later, after completing her own engineering degree and deciding that her life was going to be built in the same place as his. They settled in Dublin, a suburb of Columbus, and raised me and my younger brother with the specific intensity of people who understood from direct personal experience what the difference between opportunity and the absence of it actually felt like to live inside. I was not pressured into research. I want to be precise about this, because the shorthand version of immigrant family expectation tends to flatten something more nuanced. My parents wanted me to find work that demanded everything I had, that was stable enough to build a life on, and that was meaningful enough to justify the sacrifice they had made to place me in a position to choose it freely. Pediatric pharmacology research met all 3 of those requirements in a way I had identified by the time I was 19, and I pursued it with the same deliberateness they had brought to every decision that preceded mine. I completed my undergraduate biochemistry degree at Ohio State with a 3.94 GPA and was accepted into the doctoral program in clinical pharmacology at Harvard University, a research institution in Columbus with a nationally ranked pharmacy school and a pharmacology department that had produced 3 NIH-funded research centers in the preceding decade. I was assigned to the laboratory of Dr. Lawrence Davenport, who held a tenured professorship, an NIH R01 research grant worth $2.3 million, and a departmental reputation as a demanding but productive mentor whose doctoral graduates published consistently and placed well in competitive postdoctoral fellowships. At the beginning, that reputation appeared entirely earned. Davenport was precise and high expectation in a way I found clarifying rather than discouraging. He gave detailed feedback on my early proposals, pushed me toward more rigorous methodology, and seemed genuinely invested in the quality of the research question I was constructing. My dissertation examined how cancer cells in pediatric patients develop acquired resistance to multi-drug treatment protocols, specifically, what clinical patterns could be identified to predict that resistance and potentially interrupt it before it compromised treatment outcomes. The research had direct implications for how oncologists approach treatment sequencing in children. I cared about it with the kind of sustained attention that only comes from believing the work matters beyond the degree that it will eventually produce. The composition notebooks were my system from the beginning. 7 of them across 4 years, each labeled with the semester and year on the inside cover, filled with dated entries in blue ink, experimental setups, results, tested hypotheses, questions that one data set generated toward the next. I had developed this habit in my undergraduate lab and carried it directly into doctoral work without deliberating about it. It was simply how I operated, the physical, dated, handwritten record of a mind working through a problem in real time. By the end of my second year, the dynamic with Davenport had shifted in ways I noticed before I named them accurately. He became less available for the kind of substantive methodological conversations that had characterized my first year. When we did meet, his questions about my data had a quality of extraction to them. He wanted precise understanding of what I had found without contributing much to how I was thinking about it. He began including my preliminary findings in departmental presentations without attributing them by name, framing them as output from his lab rather than from my specific research trajectory. When I raised this once, carefully, in a one-on-one meeting, he said attribution would come when the work reached formal publication. I accepted that and kept my notebooks. In my third year, Davenport restructured my dissertation committee without explanation. Dr. Carol Novak, an associate professor of pharmacology who had served on my committee from the beginning and engaged with my work with the particular enthusiasm of someone who found the research genuinely interesting, was removed and replaced with two faculty members who were close colleagues of Davenport and had minimal direct expertise in pediatric oncology pharmacology. I asked Davenport about the change. He said Dr. Novak had a scheduling conflict with my projected defense timeline. I later learned, from Dr. Novak herself, that she had not been informed of the committee change until it had already been processed by the graduate school. That was the moment I began keeping a different kind of record. In addition to the composition notebooks, I started maintaining a dated log on my personal computer, not my university-issued laptop, my own, of every meeting with Davenport, every presentation in which my data appeared without attribution, every communication that felt oriented toward extracting understanding of my work rather than advancing it. I did not know specifically what I was building. I only understood that the documentation habit that had served me in the lab was worth extending to everything else connected to it. By the end of my fourth year, the dissertation was substantially complete. 312 pages covering the full arc of the research, methodology, data analysis, clinical pattern findings, and a discussion section I had revised 11 times because I wanted the language to be exact in the way that clinical recommendations need to be exact when the patients they concern are children. My defense was scheduled for a Thursday in November. I had been preparing for the oral examination for 6 weeks, running practice sessions with 2 friends from the graduate cohort in my apartment kitchen until the material moved through me as naturally in conversation as it did on the page. On a Tuesday afternoon 22 days before the defense date, I was at my desk on the 4th floor running a PubMed search for a citation I needed to update in my references. PubMed is the federal database for published biomedical research, the complete record of peer-reviewed clinical pharmacology literature. I had used it hundreds of times. The search was routine. The title appeared in the 4th result. Acquired Resistance Patterns in Pediatric Oncology, a Multi-Drug Analysis. Lawrence Davenport, PhD, Journal of Clinical Pharmacology. Published 18 days earlier. I clicked to the abstract. I read the first sentence. By the 4th sentence, I had stopped reading and started recognizing the specific, physical experience of encountering your own thinking in a form that carries another person's name. The abstract was mine. The framing of the central research question was mine. The language of the methodology preview, the specific verb choices, the structural sequence, the precise way I had described the patient cohort selection criteria, was mine. Rendered into polished academic prose from the draft I had emailed to Davenport 14 months earlier. I sat at that desk for 19 minutes, and then I stood up. I pulled the 6th composition notebook from my bag, the one covering my 3rd doctoral year, during which the core analytical framework had been developed, and I opened it to the entry dated 14 months earlier. The methodology described in Davenport's published paper was a direct rendering of what was written on that page in blue ink, with a margin note in my own hand asking whether the approach would hold across a larger patient sample. Not inspired by it. Not parallel to it. Derived from it, sentence structure by sentence structure, from my handwritten entry to his published methodology section. I closed the notebook. I went home. I spent the next 48 hours reading the published paper against my dissertation drafts with systematic, documented precision and researching U.S. copyright law as it applied to unpublished academic work. What I found was this: under United States copyright law, an original work is protected from the moment of its creation. Registration with the Copyright Office is not required for the underlying rights to exist. It is required to pursue statutory damages in a federal infringement lawsuit. But the authorship rights vest automatically at the moment the work is fixed in a tangible medium. My composition notebooks were tangible. My email drafts were tangible. The 847 pages of progressive draft material I had sent to Davenport's university email address across 4 years, each one time-stamped by the mail server with a date, a time, and the content of my intellectual work at that stage of its development, was a record of authorship that preceded his publication by up to 4 years. I contacted Davenport on the third morning after the discovery. I emailed him at 8:17 a.m. asking to meet that afternoon. He replied within 20 minutes and suggested 3 p.m. in his office. If you are still with me right now and you are carrying the weight of what that 48 hours of knowing and waiting feels like, the specific compression of building your case while sitting across the hall from the person who made it necessary, subscribe to KarmaArchives before we go any further. Every story here belongs to someone who waited until they were completely ready and then moved with everything they had. Stay with me. I arrived at Davenport's office at 3 p.m. with the 6th composition notebook under my arm, a printed copy of his published paper, and a printed copy of the corresponding section of my dissertation draft. The version emailed to him 14 months earlier, with the server timestamp visible in the document header. His office carried the particular density of a tenured professor's 20-year accumulation, journals organized by year on every shelf, framed grant acknowledgments on the wall behind his desk, an afternoon window overlooking the campus quad that made the room look more welcoming than it felt. He gestured to the chair across from him without standing. I sat down and placed the printed pages on the desk facing him. I told him I had found the publication. I told him I had compared it against my dissertation drafts with the full email timestamp chain going back 4 years. I told him I had the composition notebooks and the complete developmental record of the work. I said it without raising my voice, without elaborating beyond the documented sequence, the way you state facts to someone who cannot alter the documentation they are attached to. He looked at the pages for a moment. Then he looked at me with the particular composure of a man who has held institutional authority in the same building for 2 decades and has not yet absorbed the possibility that it will not hold now. Your name will be on future work, he said. This was a collaborative publication. I said, there is no co-authorship on this paper. No acknowledgement. My committee does not know this paper exists. He leaned back in his chair. You contributed data. I wrote the science. I opened the 6th composition notebook to the entry from 14 months earlier and placed it beside the methodology section of his published paper without saying anything. I let the 2 documents sit next to each other on his desk. He looked at them for several seconds. The composure held, but something behind it shifted, the visible recalibration of a person who had prepared for a different version of this meeting and was now choosing a different strategy. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped in temperature. No one, then she said, go to the Research Integrity Office tonight. Not tomorrow. I am going to make a phone call before you get there. If you have ever had someone with decades of institutional authority look at the evidence of what you made and tell you that your word will not be believed over theirs, leave a comment below and tell me what that moment did to you. Because that sentence is the last instrument available to a person whose position depends entirely on your silence, and it stops working the moment you walk out of the room and call someone who knows what to do next. Harvard University's Research Integrity Office operated under federal guidelines established by the Office of Research Integrity within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the federal body that oversees research misconduct at institutions receiving federal funding. Davenport's lab was funded by a $2.3 million NIH R01 grant. That funding created a federal accountability layer that made his misconduct not only a university disciplinary matter, but a potential federal research integrity violation carrying consequences beyond anything the university could impose on its own. I arrived at the Research Integrity Office at 5:40 p.m. Dr. Elaine Frost, the deputy director, had received Dr. Novak's phone call 20 minutes before I walked through the door. She was seated at her desk with a legal pad already open. I gave her the composition notebooks, the printed comparison documents, the full email timestamp chain, and a written statement I had prepared across the preceding 48 hours laying out the dissertation's development in chronological order cross-referenced against the publication's content, section by section. She asked 3 questions. Was the email chain sent from a personal address or a university-issued one? Personal address to his university address, with server records on both ends. Had I signed any agreement assigning intellectual property in my dissertation to the university or to Davenport's lab? I had signed the standard graduate school enrollment agreement, which assigned no such rights to a faculty supervisor. And had I registered any portion of the work with the Copyright Office? I had not registered formally, but I understood that registration was not required for the underlying rights to exist. She nodded. That is correct, she said. What you have is a 4-year timestamped developmental record. That is precisely what this process requires. The Research Integrity Office opened a formal investigation the following morning. Davenport was notified and placed on administrative leave from all supervisory and teaching duties, pending the investigation's conclusion. My doctoral committee was immediately reconstituted. Dr. Novak was reinstated. The 2 Davenport-affiliated members were recused under the conflict of interest policy, and 2 external faculty members with direct pediatric oncology pharmacology expertise were appointed by the graduate school dean. The investigation panel spent 11 weeks reviewing the full email archive, my composition notebooks, Davenport's submission correspondence with the Journal of Clinical Pharmacology, and the manuscript development files on his university-issued computer, files to which the university's IT department had access as a condition of his administrative leave. Those computer files contained something the panel described in its formal report as particularly significant in the context of the misconduct finding. A folder labeled with my name, organized by chapter, containing my dissertation draft materials, with Davenport's editorial annotations made in tracked changes after each version had been emailed to him. The source documents from which he had produced his published manuscript, organized and annotated on his own work computer, in a folder bearing the name of the student he had told would never be believed. He had kept everything labeled on the university server. The panel's formal finding: Lawrence Davenport had engaged in research misconduct constituting plagiarism and misappropriation of a doctoral student's intellectual work in violation of the university's research integrity policy, the federal standards of the Office of Research Integrity, and the terms and conditions of his NIH R01 grant award. The university acted within 10 days of the panel's final report. Davenport's tenure was revoked. His employment at Harwich University was terminated. His NIH R01 grant was referred to the National Institutes of Health Office of Research Integrity with a formal recommendation for grant termination and a federal debarment determination. The NIH determination resulted in a 5-year debarment from federal research funding across all agencies, meaning Lawrence Davenport could not apply for, receive, or supervise any federally funded research for 5 years from the date of the finding. The Journal of Clinical Pharmacology received the Research Integrity Panel's findings through a formal communication from the university. The editorial board conducted its own review. The paper, Acquired Resistance Patterns in Pediatric Oncology, a multi-drug analysis published under Lawrence Davenport's name alone, was formally retracted from the journal's record in February of the following year. The retraction notice stated that the work had been found to constitute misappropriation of another researcher's intellectual contribution and did not represent original scholarship by the listed author. It has carried that notation in the permanent journal record ever since. My doctoral defense was rescheduled for the 3rd Thursday of February, 14 weeks after the original date, with a fully reconstituted committee, in front of an audience that included Dr. Novak in the front row and my parents seated directly behind her. My father wore the suit he had worn to every formal occasion since my undergraduate graduation. My mother carried the small silk pouch she held when she was nervous and doing her best not to show it. I defended in 2 hours and 11 minutes. The committee's deliberation took 22 minutes. I received my doctorate in clinical pharmacology, conferred with distinction, on a Thursday afternoon in February, in a wood-paneled room on the 4th floor of a building 4 floors above the lab, where I had spent 1,461 days, becoming someone who knew exactly what she had made. Before my last thought, if this story gave you what you came here for today, whether that was the satisfaction of a documented case closing exactly the way it should, or something quieter than that, subscribe to KarmaArchives right now. New stories post every single day. Everyone ends with the outcome the evidence was always pointing toward. Hit the notification bell and stay close. 6 months after the university investigation concluded, I filed a federal copyright infringement suit against Davenport personally in the Southern District of Ohio, alleging willful copyright infringement under 17 U.S.C. Section 504, which provides for statutory damages of up to $150,000 per work in cases where willfulness is established. My attorney, a Columbus-based intellectual property litigator named Marcus Teller, who had spent 12 years on academic and research IP cases, filed service on a Monday. Davenport's attorney contacted Marcus's office within 3 weeks. The case settled out of court 9 months later for an amount I am unable to specify under the settlement terms, except to say it covered my legal fees, the stipend income one had lost during the disrupted semester, and a sum reflecting the publication credit, the grant co-authorship credit, and the research platform that 4 years of documented original work had always entitled me to. The first composition notebook is on my desk in the postdoctoral research office I now hold at a Children's Hospital Research Center in Cincinnati. Black and white marbled cover, my name written on the inside in the same blue ink as every entry, September 4th of my first doctoral year in the upper right corner. The handwriting inside belongs to a 25-year-old in a lab that smelled of ethanol and centrifuge heat, working through a research problem she did not yet fully understand, documenting her thinking with a precision she had developed as a scientific habit and which turned out to matter in ways entirely outside the science. I kept all 7 notebooks and will keep them permanently, not because I need them for any ongoing legal purpose, but because they are the truest record of what original work looks like before it is formatted and submitted and given someone else's name. They are what 4 years of intellectual labor looks like when it belongs entirely to the person who made it. I want to name the specific power structure that makes what happened to me possible, because I do not think it gets described precisely enough in the conversations that typically follow cases like mine. A doctoral advisor in a research university holds a nearly total concentration of institutional authority over the students assigned to them. They control committee composition, publication timing, grant access, recommendation letters, and professional network placement. The structural assumption of the relationship is that the advisor's authority serves the student's development. When that assumption is violated, when the relationship inverts and the student's intellectual output flows upward to enrich the advisor, the very power concentration that was supposed to protect the student becomes the primary instrument of the exploitation. What protected me was documentation that I had never thought of as protection. The notebooks I kept from scientific habit. The email drafts I sent without legal strategy. The digital timestamps I had never organized for any purpose beyond my own record-keeping. I was protected by having always worked as though what I was building was worth keeping precise track of, because I believed in it, and that belief turned out to be the foundation on which every subsequent step was constructed. If you are a graduate student, a researcher, a writer, a designer, a developer, anyone who produces original work in an environment where someone else carries more institutional authority than you, document everything from the beginning. Date everything. Keep copies outside any system your institution or your supervisor controls. The existence of your work before the person who might claim it is the only thing that makes the sentence "no one will believe you" into something that does not end the story. It makes it into the beginning of the case. What would you have done in those 48 hours between finding the publication and walking into his office, knowing exactly what you were about to say, and knowing what someone with 20 years of institutional authority behind him was likely to say back? Leave your answer below. I read every comment, and I am not saying that as a courtesy. If you are not subscribed to KarmaArchives, this is the moment. Every story here is built on the same foundation. Documented truth, presented through the right process to the right institution, is more permanent than any authority that tried to erase it. I'm Priya. Thank you for being here.